Howdy my tubular totally gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video. And today's ranking video is going to be on a shooter series. We're going to be looking at the Shadow Warrior series of games. Now I can hear you right now. Tubular Jonathan, what the heck is a Shadow Warrior? Well, let me explain. See, back in the 90s, a company known as 3D Realms made Duke Nukem 3D, one of the most innovative, greatest first-person shooters of all time that is pretty beloved. They would actually make basically a spiritual successor known as Shadow Warrior. It was another ultra-violent, over-the-top, sexist, borderline racist first-person shooter running on the Build engine. When it was released, it actually did get a lot of praise thanks to its awesome levels, its great gameplay, and challenge. And Lo Wang, as stereotypical as he was, would go on to be a legendary character in the first-person shooter genre. However, after some expansions, Shadow Warrior would basically just quietly disappear as 3D Realms would get preoccupied with other stuff. It would actually be 15 whole years before the series would be rebooted by Flying Wild Hog Games in a completely reimagined form. Shadow Warrior was still a first-person shooter, but now it was modernized. It had a lot of modern game mechanics, and Lo Wang was no longer as stereotypical as before. And just like that, Shadow Warrior was back, baby. Shadow Warrior would go on to get 2 more sequels, and that's where we are today, with 4 total Shadow Warrior games. And so now you know what a Shadow Warrior is. It really is a series of first-person shooters starring Lo Wang as he pretty much kills everything that moves. All 4 of these games are actually pretty different from each other despite all being shooters, and they are all varying in quality. People like all of these games for different reasons, but I think just about everyone can agree that in all of them, the shooting is pretty solid. So we're going to rank them worst to best. We're going to look at all of them, and I'm going to give my thoughts on each one of them. I played all the new ones when they came out, and have quite enjoyed all of these Shadow Warrior games. Let me know what your favorite is down below. Like, share, comment, sub, all that good stuff. Let's just get right into it. Out of these games, what do I think is the weakest? I think the weakest of them all is Shadow Warrior 2, originally releasing in 2016. Now, don't get me wrong, Shadow Warrior 2 is actually still a good game, and it does have a lot of fun moments. I think when you just compare all of them against each other, though, yeah, it is the weakest. The game is again about Lo Wang, and he works for the Yakuza. He's given a couple different tasks. One of the tasks he is given is to save Kamiko, the daughter of the Yakuza leader. He goes to find her, and then basically she's injected with this substance known as Compound 61, and they actually are able to put her in Lo Wang's mind. They put her in his body because she was really messed up, and Lo Wang doesn't want to bring her back in pieces, basically. And so it's up to him to find a cure to help her and get her out of his body. The story, yeah, it's pretty stupid, and I wasn't really that big on it. There's a bunch of different characters here, but I didn't think like anyone was memorable outside of Lo Wang. Lo Wang continues to be the asshole he's always been, and you know, he's pretty good. Outside of the story, though, this game has a bunch of differences from the other Shadow Warrior games. First off, you can play through the whole game in up to 4-player co-op. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I never got to really play this because nobody else I know got the game, but you could play the whole game in co-op. The next thing is that this is a very different type of shooter from the first new Shadow Warrior game. In that game, it was a bit more slower and methodical. This game, you move around like crazy. You got all these boosts. You can double jump. You can climb stuff. It's a lot faster paced. And then you have a ton of weapons. The first new Shadow Warrior had like 10 weapons, maybe a dozen. This game has upwards of 50, maybe 60 different weapons. Seriously, there are a bunch of guns and melee weapons you get. You get so many weapons in this game. You can carry up to 8, so you get to choose what you want to hold. And you can just go on a killing spree with a bunch of these different weapons. A lot of them feel really great. And while some of them don't really feel different from each other, particularly the melee weapons, you can still, again, go on an absolute tear here. There's a bunch of different new enemies to kill. Some of them, yeah, they're pretty annoying, I won't lie, but there's a bunch of different enemies here, so the variety's definitely there with the arsenal and the enemies. The way the levels and environments are structured is totally different from the other Shadow Warrior games also. They're a lot more open and non-linear. You have big areas to explore and find stuff in, and it's all randomly generated. Yeah, almost every level in this game is just completely randomly generated, and it pulls from randomized map layouts, enemy positions, terrain, buildings, and even weather conditions. And then lastly, the game throws in a bunch of weird looter-shooter elements, like each weapon has damage with the numbers, and then there's leveling up gear and different types of rarity for said gear, and yeah, I didn't like this very much at all. I wasn't a big fan of the random levels or the gear stuff in this game. I think it is just really out of place for Shadow Warrior, and it's just kind of out of place for this game. I don't think it really adds much to it, and I was not a fan of these random levels because a lot of the time it just repeats certain level parts over and over, and I just didn't think it was this fulfilling. I didn't think a lot of the levels were super engaging. The combat encounters are engaging enough, but I just didn't love the levels. It just felt like I was going through one empty area to the next. And the looter shooter stuff honestly just feels tacked on. It feels really unnecessary, and it goes along with like the upgrade system and all that. And yeah, I wasn't loving it. And this was before looter shooters like Destiny completely took over. So now I'm just groaning. I'm like, ugh, why is this in the game? It's not even a very good loot system. Like 99% of the time you get just absolute trash, like just throw away garbage. It's just clutter. Again, maybe I didn't have the best experience because I didn't play in co-op. I shouldn't have to play in co-op though. Again, this is a Shadow Warrior game. I think the game is still good. Don't get me wrong. It's still a fun time. If you like shooters, you should try it out. I just think it's just alright. And so here we have the latest in the Shadow Warrior series, Shadow Warrior 3, releasing this year in 2022. Now, Shadow Warrior 3, I think for the most part was a pretty enjoyable game, but I can see why some people were a bit disappointed with it. The game takes place after that confusing cliffhanger ending that Shadow Warrior 2 had, where a dragon is unleashed and starts destroying the world. This takes place a bit later, where the dragon has basically destroyed the world. And so it's up to Lo Wang and whatever people are left on this planet to kill the dragon. And the story is fine enough. There wasn't really anything wrong with it. The writing is pretty goofy, it's pretty cheesy, and all the characters have some humorous aspects. I think the game actually was decently funny. There is some good jokes here. And the story was just fine. It's not like amazing or anything, but I liked it more than the second games, that's for sure. And Lo Wang, again, is the best character here. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, it is pretty different from all the other Shadow Warriors. Again, it is still an old school shooter, but this game really just looks at Doom Eternal and is like, how do we make it like Doom Eternal? Okay, it's not that bad, but it has a lot of elements from Doom Eternal. You can boost all around, you can double jump, you have a grappling hook that you can swing around with, and yeah, it's just a very fast-paced game, and of course, there's glory kills. I gotta say though, these are some sweet ass executions. Now, instead of there being like 70 weapons and them being unmemorable and not really all that different from each other, we have like 8 or so weapons that are all very different from each other. They all feel really great here though. I really did like the weapon selection. I liked how unique everything was, and I liked how you could upgrade each one. And you could upgrade them to the point where they feel pretty different from their initial state, which is always a fun time. It really gives that progression feeling. When it comes to the enemies in this game, there are a bunch of different enemies here, and all of them have their own unique attributes and way you're supposed to go about them. And when you execute certain ones, you actually get their weapon, which is pretty cool, so then you can use that for a little bit. The levels are, again, a lot more like Doom Eternal. They're very, very linear, with lots of platforming and basically being dropped into these big arenas where you just kind of kill everything that moves. Most of the arenas are pretty good. The level design in general, I'd actually say, is pretty solid. There is a lot of platforming, and the platforming is very basic, and it does get a little old by the end of it, where I'm just like, I just want to go to the next area. I don't need to do all this platforming. But for the most part, I thought it was actually quite enjoyable, and I thought that the story was pretty well paced. The pacing is pretty good throughout. This game isn't the longest. I know a lot of people really were kind of pooping on it because it's like 5 or 6 hours, but I gotta say, while it is short, and while it is disappointing that it is short, this is a very tightly paced game. There is no fluff here, there is no BS here. You are dropped right into the action, and it's just from 1 to 100 pretty much the entire time, and I gotta really appreciate that. A lot of games don't have that kind of pacing. Not even the 2 other new Shadow Warrior games have that, and so that is really appreciated. Another thing that I know some people weren't happy with is the difficulty. This game is rather easy. You want to play on hard or the hardest difficulty because it's just too easy in any other setting. Shadow Warrior 3 is definitely one of those games where it's there for a good time, not a long time. While you don't get a really long, epic campaign, what you do get is an incredibly fun time with a very tight-knit campaign and an excellent presentation. The game looks great. This is pretty much an indie game, or like a AA game at most. It looks great, it has great music, Lo Wang's great, and the combat is generally really fun. I thought it was an incredibly fun time. If you like Doom Eternal, yeah, you should totally play this. It's, again, not the longest, so probably get it on sale or when it's on Game Pass or the PlayStation Plus thing or whatever, but it's a good time. And so here we have the first of the new Shadow Warrior games, just titled Shadow Warrior, releasing in 2013. Now, I remember when this game got announced and when it came out, there was actually a fair amount of hype behind it from shooter enthusiasts who really wanted to see Shadow Warrior come back and really loved the original game. And I gotta admit, I was actually pretty excited too. I got it day one and was, yeah, pretty happy with it. The story is pretty different from every other Shadow Warrior game, where it sees Lo Wang working for Zilla as he's trying to collect this ancient katana. He has to team up with this demon named Hoji at one point, and yeah, shit just hits the fan real quick. I'll leave it at that. The game actually does have a decent emphasis on Lo Wang, the characters, and the story, and you know the story is fine enough. Lo Wang is pretty goofy, and he does have a lot of good one-liners, and I liked him for the most part. He's very different from the old Lo Wang, yes, but I still think he was a decent enough character, and the other characters were fine enough. Nobody's like amazing here, and nobody's writing's gonna win any awards, that's for sure, but again, it was fine enough, and it's a good plot for the most part. Now, when it comes to the first-person shooter action, I know a lot of people were really just kind of confused with this game, especially when it came out. They expected something like the original Shadow Warrior, and while this game is still an old-school shooter, especially for the time, it is very different from that original Shadow Warrior game. It is still a very linear game where you basically go through hallways and into arenas and kill, again, everything that moves. You just slice and dice your way with the swords, or you blow shit up with the guns. This game does have a pretty decent weapon roster. It does have some throwbacks to the original Shadow Warrior, but there are actually some new weapons here, and most of them are actually pretty decent. Some of them are weak as shit, though, I won't lie. And then you have the sword. The sword is stupidly good in this game. It is the best weapon, and you actually get a bunch of sword abilities, and I always remember really liking the sword abilities. You can do a bunch of different stuff with them, like spin around with them, do a stab, shoot a beam from it. I really did like the sword gameplay. There's also a pretty decent enemy roster here. There's a bunch of different demons, whether it's shield demons, big demons, little demons, or the occasional Yakuza you'll kill. I think it's actually a pretty good enemy roster, and it leads to a really fun time where you're just getting into these big encounters, fighting tons of people, blowing them up, mowing them down with the sword, and yeah, I really did like it. All the levels, again, are super linear. There are some secrets here. There's even some fun little throwbacks to the original Shadow Warrior, and they did this before Doom 2016. The game has a bunch of other Easter eggs thrown in there as well, and cameos from other Devolver games like Serious Sam and Hotline Miami, and the game even had a pretty good presentation. Again, this is basically an indie game released in the early 2010s. I thought it looked pretty good. To keep things interesting, they have a whole upgrade system for Lo Wang and his weapons, and the game actually has a pretty decent length to it, taking over 10 hours. It was actually pretty decently length and paced, and I just remember really enjoying it, and you know, all these years later, I'm like, yeah, this is still probably the best of the new Shadow Warrior games. I think that it's just barely the best, but I really did enjoy it. I still think it is a good game, and if you like shooters, haven't played it yet, totally check it out. But I think most people can agree that nothing has ever been able to top that original Shadow Warrior coming out all the way back in 1997 by 3D Realms. The original Shadow Warrior was one of the Build Engine's best games and one of the best shooters of the 90s. And you know, the setup, it wasn't this crazy setup with this in-depth plot and all these different characters and personalities. No, the setup is pretty simple in the original Shadow Warrior. You just play as this old man named Lo Wang, and you go after this evil conglomerate owner known as Zilla. He's pretty freaking evil though. And when it comes to the gameplay, this is that peak Build Engine, boomer shooter, late 90s, first-person shooter gameplay that so many games are trying to have throwbacks to. But you know what? All these years later, Shadow Warrior still stands at like the top of the pack as one of the very best shooters of not only the 90s, but of all time. The game just absolutely has everything going for it. 3D Realms were just at the top of their game, and they were making some not only excellent levels, but enemies, weapons, difficulty. And Lo Wang nowadays, yeah, it's pretty racist. He says some pretty awful stuff, and he's very sexist as well. But you know what? If we just take Lo Wang's character out of this, we still have a great game. I think one of the strongest things about the original Shadow Warrior is the level design. Now, Duke Nukem 3D had fantastic level design where it was really open, you could explore stuff, there were tons of enemies, nooks and crannies, and even some puzzles thrown in here and there. And Shadow Warrior really is more of the same. It's these big open areas with a ton to see, bunch of little nook and crannies and secrets, the occasional puzzle, and of course, a bunch of enemies placed all over. The level design really is like some of the peak level design from the 90s. It's just so different and memorable and engaging, and every level feels really different from the last. No two levels honestly feel alike, and it just has a really good amount of variety to it. And then we get to the encounters, which, I mean, it's pretty much the same story. You have a pretty decent weapon roster here. You can carry all your weapons at once, and you get some really interesting stuff. You start out, of course, with a sword. You can eventually get some Uzis, a rocket launcher, grenade launcher, some shurikens. Yeah, there's a bunch of different weapons here. There's a good variety, and you got plenty of different enemies to kill. There's a ton of different enemies in this game. And while fighting all of them isn't amazing, those suicide bombers, but it's still a really good time to fight just about everything in this game. And then this game is not fucking around at all. This game is seriously not messing around. It is no problem kicking your ass to the curb and telling you to pay rent. Like, this game will throw everything at you, including the kitchen sink, because it's just not messing around. Enemies kill you really quickly, there's a lot of almost instant death moments, and you're going to be saving a lot. On top of all of this, Shadow Warrior was actually a pretty ambitious and forward-thinking game. It was kind of ahead of its time in a number of different aspects for first-person shooters. For example, the game actually has turrets in it. You can get down and, kill stuff in a turret. That had never been in any first-person shooter. The game also had various vehicles that you could get in. There's climbable ladders, and then every weapon, as if the roster wasn't good enough, actually has alternate firing modes. A lot of this stuff wasn't really in shooters at all, if it was in any shooter. And I just think that when everything comes together, you have absolutely one of the very best first-person shooters you could ever play right here. It's very fun, it's engaging, it's challenging, it's got everything you're looking for in a shooter, and it's also mad cheap. It's available on Steam for free if you want to play the older version, or you can pay a couple bucks for the newer version. Now, don't get it twisted. The rebooted series is good too. There's some really good fun to be had there. I just think the original game kicks so much ass and is so great, and it's kind of unbeatable when it comes to the other Shadow Warrior games. I think instead of focusing on the reboot and current trends at the time, I think honestly they should probably just remake the original game and maybe change up Lo Wang's character a bit. I feel like the Shadow Warrior series kind of has an identity crisis, honestly. All four of these games are first-person shooters, yes, but they're all pretty drastically different. We got a boomer shooter, then we got some weird hybrid of a boomer shooter and something modern, then we got this weird, looter shooter kind of game, and now we have a Doom Eternal clone. What is going on with this series? This is all over the place. Again, these are all fun games. There's some fun to be had here with all of them. I think the best is the original, but I have no problem recommending the series. And that's it for this video. I hope everyone has a good day. Hope everyone has a good night, holiday, whatever. See ya. Comment bricks if you made it to this part. Bye-bye.